Heterodox Views of Money and Modern Monetary Theory, MMT, by Phil Armstrong. Modern Monetary Theory, MMT. We are now in a position to consider the core propositions of MMT and the extent to which they are consistent with state and credit theories of money. MMT is founded on the insights provided by the state theory of money. Money is chattel, a creation of the state. In MMT, money is considered as a social institution, where credit and credit alone is money. A full examination of the genesis of MMT is well beyond the scope of this paper, but at least we can note the clear links between the work of John Maynard Keynes and chartelism. The state, therefore, comes in first of all as the authority of law, which enforces the payment of the thing which corresponds to the name or description in the contract. But it comes in doubly when, in addition, it claims the right to determine and declare what thing corresponds to the name, and to vary its declaration from time to time, when, that is to say, it claims the right to re-edit the dictionary. This right is claimed by all modern states and has been so claimed for some 4,000 years at least. Abba Lerner, especially in his development of functional finance, can be seen as a clear forerunner of MMT. The modern state can make anything it chooses generally acceptable as money, and thus establish its value quite apart from any connection, even of the most formal kind, with gold or with backing of any kind. It is true that a simple declaration that such and such is money will not do, even if backed by the most convincing constitutional evidence of the state's absolute sovereignty. But if the state is willing to accept the proposed money in payment of taxes and other obligations, the trick is done. He goes on. Depression occurs only if the amount of money spent is insufficient. Inflation occurs only if the amount of money spent is excessive. The government, which is what the state means in practice, by virtue of its power to create or destroy money by fiat, and its power to take money away by taxation, is in a position to keep the rate of spending in the economy at the level required to fulfill its two great responsibilities: the prevention of depression and the maintenance of the value of money. An excellent summary of the distinctive nature of MMT is provided by Warren Mosler in his statement of purpose. In recent correspondence, he noted succinctly, MMT recognizes that the currency is a public monopoly. Taxes function to create unemployment, and the funds used to make payments to the government come from the government. The price level is a function of prices paid by government, and loans create both deposits and required reserves. The national debt is nothing more than the dollars spent by the government that haven't yet been used to pay taxes and remain outstanding as net savings in the economy until used to pay taxes. They rest in the form of cash, reserve balances at the Fed, and balances in securities accounts at the Fed. Mosler, whilst appreciating the foundational work of Lerner, notes the absence of explicit analysis of the ability of the state to act as a price setter from the article quoted above. Since the government is the monopoly issuer of the state money which is required to pay taxes, the price level is necessarily a function of the prices paid by the government when it spends and or the collateral it demands when it lends. This view is developed by Ray, who states that the government can determine the value of money by setting the price it is willing to pay. He develops his analysis in considerable detail and notes that there is an and asymmetry involved. It is easier to cause inflation than it is to cause deflation. If the government continuously raises the price it is willing to pay for each item it purchases, this is quite likely also to cause prices of items sold in private markets to rise, due both to demand effects, household income, and thus demand is higher, and supply effects. Private buyers will have to compete to some degree with government for at least some of the things sold. He considers that if the government lowers its buy prices, sellers might at first prefer to sell to private buyers where possible. However, as the government reduces its expenditure, this will in turn reduce household income and spending. Eventually, market prices also decline as a general deflation spreads throughout the private economy. After some point, the government announced buy prices become competitive. Mosler also considers that the contention inflation occurs only if the amount of money spent is excessive might be viewed as questionable. First, defining inflation is highly problematic, and second, however defined, it can increase for any number of reasons apart from excess demand. In conventional analysis, price rises per se are often described as inflation. However, on closer examination, it may well be the case that a price rise may be the result of the market mechanism expressing a relative price shift. For example, a temporary shortage of a particular commodity may result in a rise in its price as the market allocates available supply to buyers who then have less to spend elsewhere. The exact definition and measurement of inflation is a complex problem, and due its political significance has been the subject of wide debate. However, we might at least tentatively suggest that inflation involves a general price rise over a sustained period, even if we admit that the exact meaning of general and sustained might be difficult to establish in practice. Such a situation would imply a more deep-seated process with perhaps multiple contributory causes at work. In terms of the role of government, fiscal policy as a counter-inflationary tool, it might be suggested that the government should ensure that spending is high enough relative to taxes to generate full employment without creating inflation from excess demand. In MMT, the state is there at the start. It is not a late arrival and the villain of the piece. The state uses its power to name the monetary unit and declare how payments to it should be made. MMT explicitly recognizes that prior spending or lending by the state is required for the private sector to pay its taxes. Once the state has decided upon the unit of account, the private sector can create money denominated in this unit of account. Private sector debt can now circulate. During a conference organized by a free market think tank, I asked the key speaker an interesting question. Viewed as a whole, where does the private or non-government sector obtain the money it needs to pay its taxes? His reply provided an insight into the thinking of mainstream neoliberals who see the real nature of the monetary system as irrelevant. His answer was, paraphrasing, the private sector creates the money through productive activity. That is as far as he was prepared to go. In effect, his ethics dominate, and, whether he knows it or not, he is relying on conjectural history. As we have noted earlier, for free market advocates, money is a private sector cost-saving invention later, sadly pirated by the state. However, as a matter of accounting reality, his answer was patently false. Private sector debt or bank money is not acceptable in payment of taxes. It may at first glance appear as though it is. However, on further reflection, this view can be seen as illusion. If a private sector individual or institution pays taxes by means of a check, its bank deposit falls by the amount of the payment, but the settlement of the tax liability occurs when the taxpayer's bank's reserve account at the central bank is debited by the same amount. It is the transfer of bank reserves from the taxpayer's bank's reserve account to the treasury account that settles the tax bill. To quote Mosler, you can't have a reserve drain before a reserve add. Before the private sector can pay its taxes, the treasury or central bank must have spent or lent the money. The correct answer to my question was from earlier spending or lending by the treasury or the central bank. The only other way would involve counterfeiting of state money by the private sector. We can see that one of the key insights of MMT is the explicit recognition that the state must issue money before it can collect it. Spending precedes taxation. The currency is a public monopoly. Only money that has already been issued by the state can be collected in taxes. In this situation, the state is the price setter and can always determine the interest rate for risk-free loans of any duration. MMT also recognizes the essential function of taxes, that is, to generate unemployment. In order to move resources to itself, the state uses its power to place members of the private sector in its debt. In other words, impose a tax liability upon them. Such workers are now unemployed. They lack the necessary funds to pay their tax bill and must now seek employment in order to earn the necessary money. They may work for the state directly, for example by joining the army, or they may offer themselves for employment to a member of the private sector who has access to previously issued state money. The existence of unemployment is clear de facto evidence that net government spending is too small to move the economy to full employment. The solution follows logically. A tax cut or spending increase is required to achieve this aim. Our core or operational reality is clear. In a world free of political blockages and the monetary plumbing, where the state issues its own non-convertible currency under floating exchange rates, there is never an affordability question in a monetary sense for the government. It never has or doesn't have money. It issues money ex nihilo and can purchase anything available within its own sovereign monetary space. In such a situation, the limits of production and consumption of goods and services are real, not monetary. The quantity and quality of factors of production determine what can be produced and consumed domestically. The state must ensure the economy performs so as to ensure that the nation lives up to its means. It must use its position as a monopoly issuer of the currency to ensure full employment. MMT is entirely consistent with the sectoral balances approach, popularized by Wynne Godley and used extensively and very effectively as an analytical tool by Bill Mitchell. In macroeconomics, we have a way of looking at the national accounts, the expenditure and income data, which allows us to highlight the various sectors, the government sector and the non-government sector. So we start by focusing on the final expenditure components of consumption, C, investment, I, government spending, G, and net exports, exports minus imports, NX. The basic aggregate demand equation is GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. In other words, GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports, X minus M, exports minus imports, which says that total income, national income, GDP, is the sum of total final consumption spending, C, total private investment, I, total government spending, G, and net exports, X minus M. In terms of the uses that national income, GDP, can be put to, we say GDP equals C plus S plus T, which says that GDP income ultimately comes back to households who consume, save S, or pay taxes T with it once all the distributions are made. So if we equate these two ideas about the same thing, GDP, we get C plus S plus T equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, which we can then simplify by canceling out the C from both sides and rearranging into what we call the sectoral balances view of the national accounts. There are three sectoral balances derived: the budget deficit, G minus T, government spending minus taxes; the current account balance, X minus M, exports minus imports; and the private domestic balance, S minus I, savings minus investment. The equation is S minus I equals G minus T plus X minus M. The sectoral balances equation says that total private savings, S, minus private investment, I, has to equal the public deficit, spending, G minus T, taxes, plus net exports, exports X, minus imports M, where net exports represent the net savings of non-residents. Taking the UK or USA as an example, given the persistence of a current account deficit, X less than M, exports less than imports, the private sector can only net save, S greater than I, savings greater than investment, if there is a public sector deficit, G greater than T, government spending greater than taxes. Given the likely desire of the private sector to wish to net save, the public sector deficit must be large enough to satisfy private net savings desires plus the current account deficit at the full employment level of income. If the deficit is too small, the private sector will not be able to realize its net savings desires at full employment income, and assuming no change in the current account deficit, income will fall until desired saving equals actual investment. The government's fiscal policy should be designed to achieve the goal of full employment. A deficit would only be too large if it increased private sector net saving beyond desired levels at the full employment level of income. In this case, inflation would be the result. The size of the public sector deficit and debt would be of no consequence in themselves. Only the macroeconomic outcomes matter. The existence of significant unemployment or underemployment would be de facto evidence that the deficit was too small, no matter its absolute size or its magnitude in relation to national income. MMT distinguishes clearly between countries that issue their own non-convertible currencies and those that don't. For example, nations using the euro. Euro-using nations have ceded their money issuing power to another entity, the European Central Bank. Each nation's government is forced to act as a currency user, rather reminiscent of U.S. states. In this case, taxes do fund spending. Borrowing from private sector euro holders may be necessary to fund spending. Default is technically possible and, In the absence of ECB assistance, the need to sell debt on bond markets may drive yields to very high levels. MMT provides a compelling picture of the core or operational reality which is present in monetary systems. MMT makes a clear distinction between the operational reality present when governments issue their own fiat currency under floating exchange rates and the different core reality that exists under a regime where the currency is convertible into a commodity at a fixed rate or in a fixed exchange rate regimes. Each operational monetary reality has an accompanying socio-political layer. Elements of this layer may be essential responses required to maintain the operational integrity of the monetary system, or they may be unnecessary additional constraints which are imposed for primarily ideological reasons.